$130. That is what two men received for creating one of the most valuable fictional characters ever conceived. Not a royalty, not an equity stake, not a percentage of future earnings, a flat payment, a signed contract, and a complete, permanent transfer of ownership. While Superman went on to generate billions across 8 decades of comics, television, radio, and film, the two men who built him from nothing struggled financially for most of their adult lives. This is not a story about talent. Both men had it. This is not a story about effort. They spent years developing the character before anyone would publish it. This is a story about a single document signed in 1938 that determined who would capture the wealth from everything that followed. In this video, we examine 4 strategies that explain how the creators of Superman lost ownership of what they built and why the wealth that followed never found its way back to them. Jerry Siegel is born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1914. Joe Shuster is born in Toronto, Canada in 1914 and moves to Cleveland as a child. The two meet at Glenville High School in Cleveland in the late 1920s. Cleveland in the early 1930s is a Depression-era industrial city. Both families are working class. Both young men are deeply interested in science fiction pulp magazines, a popular and inexpensive form of entertainment during this period. They begin collaborating early. Siegel writes, Shuster draws. They produce a school science fiction publication called The Torch. They are not professional creators. They are teenagers building a creative practice with limited resources and no industry connections. The character that will become Superman begins developing around 1932 and 1933. Early versions of the concept differ significantly from the final product. The character evolves over several years of development between Siegel and Shuster. By the mid-1930s, they have a version of Superman recognizable to modern audiences, a being with extraordinary physical abilities, a secret identity, and a mission oriented around justice. They attempt to sell the concept to newspaper syndicates and comic publishers repeatedly. They are rejected consistently over several years. The rejections are not unusual. The comic and syndication industry of the 1930s has no established framework for superhero characters. The concept is new. Publishers are cautious. In 1938, Detective Comics, a publisher based in New York, is preparing to launch a new anthology title called Action Comics. They need content. An editor contacts Siegel and Shuster about Superman, which had been submitted previously. The negotiation is brief. Detective Comics offers to purchase the Superman character and all associated rights for $130, along with a contract to produce Superman stories at a page rate. Siegel and Shuster accept. They sign over full intellectual property ownership of Superman with that transaction. The $130 is a one-time payment for the character itself. It is not an advance against future royalties. It is not an equity stake in the publishing company. It is a flat fee for permanent, complete transfer of ownership. Action Comics #1 is published in April 1938. Superman appears on the cover. When creators sell intellectual property outright, ownership transfers completely and permanently at the moment of sale. The buyer acquires not just the right to publish the work, but the legal title to the asset itself. All future revenue generated by that asset belongs to the owner, not the creator. The alternative is licensing. Under a licensing structure, the creator retains ownership and grants the buyer the right to use the property under defined terms. The license can be limited by time, territory, or medium. Royalty payments flow back to the creator based on usage. In 1938, Siegel and Shuster were not in a position to negotiate a licensing structure. They had been rejected repeatedly. They needed income. Detective Comics held all the negotiating leverage. The industry standard for work-for-hire comic creation at the time did not include creator ownership provisions. but the structural consequence was permanent. Superman was a corporate asset from the moment of sale. Every stage of the character's appreciation occurred within a legal structure that Siegel and Shuster had no ownership stake in. Action Comics #1 sells rapidly. Superman's popularity is immediate and significant. Detective Comics recognizes the character's commercial value quickly. Within a year, Superman receives his own dedicated comic title. By 1940, a Superman radio drama begins airing on American radio networks, reaching a national audience and expanding the character's cultural presence beyond print. The radio show runs until 1951. It introduces elements that become permanent parts of Superman mythology, including the character of Jimmy Olsen and the phrase "faster than a speeding bullet." Licensing follows quickly. Superman's image appears on toys, games, clothing, and promotional materials throughout the 1940s. Detective Comics, which reorganizes and becomes DC Comics, owns all licensing rights. Every commercial use of Superman's image generates revenue for the company. A Superman theatrical cartoon series produced by Fleischer Studios runs from 1941 to 1943. A live-action film serial follows in 1948. A television series starring George Reeves begins in 1952 and runs until 1958. Each new medium extends the character's reach and the company's licensing revenue. Superman is not just a comic book character by the early 1950s. He is a multimedia property generating income across multiple platforms simultaneously. DC Comics collects revenue from comic sales, licensing agreements, merchandise royalties, and broadcast rights. Each revenue stream flows from a single asset, the intellectual property ownership of Superman that was acquired for $130 in 1938. Siegel and Shuster continue working as page-rate employees, producing Superman stories through the 1940s. They are paid for their labor. They do not participate in licensing revenue. They do not receive royalties from radio or television. They have no equity stake in the asset they created. Intellectual property generates wealth differently from physical assets. A factory produces goods once. A piece of intellectual property can be licensed repeatedly across different territories, different media, and different time periods, without the original asset being diminished. Superman could appear simultaneously in comic books, on radio, in film serials, and on merchandise in the 1940s. Each appearance generated separate revenue for the owner. The same asset produced multiple income streams concurrently. This is the economic structure that makes intellectual property ownership so valuable over time. A character like Superman does not depreciate. It appreciates as cultural recognition grows, as new media platforms emerge, and as licensing markets expand globally. The owner of Superman in 1938 acquired access to all of this future value for $130. The creators received $130 and their page rate. The asymmetry between these two positions compounds across every decade of the character's commercial life. By the late 1940s, Siegel and Shuster are aware of the scale of Superman's commercial success relative to their own compensation. In 1947, they file a lawsuit against DC Comics seeking ownership rights and a share of Superman revenues. The lawsuit is unsuccessful. The court upholds the 1938 contract. The intellectual property transfer is legally valid. DC Comics retains full ownership of Superman. As part of the legal disputes resolution, DC Comics terminates their contracts. Siegel and Shuster lose their page rate work producing Superman stories. They are no longer employed to work on the character they created. The following decades are difficult for both men. Shuster's eyesight deteriorates significantly, limiting his ability to work as an artist. Siegel works in various writing capacities, but does not achieve significant commercial success outside of Superman-related work. By the 1970s, both men are in poor financial condition. The Superman film starring Christopher Reeve is in production, scheduled for a 1978 release. The film's development brings renewed public attention to the disparity between the creators' circumstances and the commercial value of their creation. A journalist named Jerry Robinson, himself a significant figure in comic book history as a creator of Batman characters, leads a public campaign drawing attention to Siegel and Shuster's situation. The campaign generates press coverage and industry pressure. In 1975, DC Comics, by then owned by Warner Communications, agrees to provide Siegel and Shuster with annual payments of $20,000 each, later increased, as well as health benefits and creator credit on Superman productions. This agreement is reached outside of court and does not involve a transfer of ownership rights. Superman remains the intellectual property of DC Comics. The financial settlement provides the creators with income and recognition, but does not change the underlying ownership structure that had been established in 1938. Jerry Siegel dies in 1996. Joe Shuster dies in 1992. Neither man owned Superman at the time of their deaths. Publishing contracts in the comic book industry during the 1930s and 1940s were structured to transfer complete ownership of characters and stories to publishers. This was not unique to Superman or to DC Comics. It was the industry standard. Writers and artists were paid page rates for content. The publisher owned the content, the characters, and all derivative rights. This structure made commercial sense from the publisher's perspective. Building a character into a franchise required significant investment in marketing, distribution, licensing infrastructure, and legal protection. Publishers bore the financial risk of development and therefore structured contracts to capture the returns. From the creator's perspective, the immediate income was real and necessary. The long-term consequences were not visible at the point of signing. In 1938, no one could accurately predict that Superman would still be generating commercial revenue in 2024. But the contract structure was permanent, and it was designed to remain permanent regardless of how valuable the asset became. The 1978 Superman film starring Christopher Reeve grosses over $300 million at the global box office. It establishes the template for the modern superhero film and demonstrates the theatrical commercial potential of comic book intellectual property. 3 sequels follow through the 1980s. A television series, Lois and Clark, runs from 1993 to 1997. Smallville runs from 2001 to 2011. Man of Steel, released in 2013, launches Superman into the DC Extended Universe, a shared cinematic framework modeled on Marvel's successful interconnected film structure. DC Comics itself has changed ownership multiple times. Warner Communications acquires DC's parent company in 1969. Time Warner later acquires Warner Communications. AT&T acquires Time Warner in 2018. Warner Brothers Discovery is formed following a subsequent merger. Through each ownership transition, Superman transfers with the DC Comics intellectual property portfolio. The character's value is embedded in the legal ownership structure that traces directly back to the 1938 transaction. Superman merchandise continues to generate revenue globally across apparel, toys, video games, and promotional licensing. The character's global recognition is among the highest of any fictional figure created in the 20th century. The precise monetary value of the Superman intellectual property is not publicly disclosed as a standalone asset, but it is a core component of a DC Comics portfolio that represents billions of dollars in value within one of the world's largest media conglomerates. Creating a valuable asset and owning the system that monetizes that asset are 2 separate economic positions. Siegel and Shuster created Superman. They developed the character's mythology, visual identity, moral framework, and narrative world over years of collaborative work. The creative contribution was substantial and original. But creative contribution does not generate compounding financial returns unless it is paired with legal ownership of the asset. DC Comics owned Superman. That ownership entitled the company to every dollar generated by the character across every medium, every territory, and every decade. The creative work produced the asset. The ownership structure determined who captured the value of that asset over time. This distinction is the central lesson of intellectual property economics. The financial returns flow to the owner of the legal title, not to the originator of the idea. Siegel and Shuster created Superman, but transferred complete intellectual property ownership to a publisher for $130 and a page rate. The publishers and the corporations that subsequently acquired them captured the compounding returns from the character across 8 decades. The pattern is consistent across industries. Creators produce cultural and commercial value. The owners of the legal structures that hold that value capture the financial returns. This is not a moral argument. Each transaction in these stories involved parties making rational decisions given available information, available capital, and available leverage. Siegel and Shuster needed a publisher. Detective Comics had the distribution infrastructure. The contract reflected the power asymmetry of that relationship, but the structural outcome is clear. The $130 payment in 1938 purchased one of the most valuable fictional characters in entertainment history. The creators received the $130. Everything that followed accumulated with the owners. Creative work builds the asset. Ownership determines who captures the wealth. If you are interested in stories that explain how capital actually moves, who builds it, who owns it, and who captures it, subscribe.